Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and as we progress with the life of A.P. Hill, he has just met with Robert E. Lee as the 7 Days Campaign began. Hill's division entrenched the northeast of Richmond, with its left resting on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. The swamp and horrid sanitation resulted in high percentages of regiments and brigades within the division losing men to typhoid fever and other illnesses. Lee's inspectors went to Hill's entrenchments and gave a great report about its status. They stated, "Hill's defenses are as well advanced as those of any part of the line. His troops are in fine condition. Hill is every inch a soldier and is destined to make his mark." During this time, an exchange of letters passed between Hill and his old friend George McClellan. Powell requested a truce to retrieve the bodies of officers and later asked for a prisoner exchange. McClellan ignored the requests, not because he had any disdain for Hill, but because the request had not come from the Army commander, Lee. Hill received a sealed letter requesting all division commanders to meet with Lee the following afternoon. On the day they were to meet, Major General Daniel Harvey Hill arrived at Lee's headquarters first, standing outside the building. He spied a figure riding toward him. He saw that it was his brother-in-law, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, riding an incredible 52 miles in 14 hours to make it to Lee. His troops had just waged a successful campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and astounded everyone with his presence at the meeting simply because they thought him still too far away at the time. A.P. Hill and Longstreet arrived together. Hill saw Jackson and remembered him as his antithesis at West Point. Lee welcomed all of his commanders into his headquarters and shut the door. This was the first time in the war that the 5 generals had been together. The men surrounding Lee were all bearded. Their uniforms were blanketed with dust. Longstreet was the oldest at 43, D.H. Hill was 40, Jackson 38, and Powell Hill was the youngest at 37. The meeting lasted for 4 hours, and Lee laid out his plan for his left to attack McClellan's right flank. Powell Hill was to force his way across the Mechanicsville Bridge, linking up with Jackson once across. D.H. Hill and Longstreet would move across and support Hill and Jackson in the attack. Jackson picked the date of the attack since his troops still had to come from the valley. He said June 25th, but Longstreet declared the timetable too close, and Lee agreed. Jackson then stated that his troops would be in position by the morning of June 26th. It was agreed. Powell Hill did not speak much in this meeting. He was the junior officer and the new division commander, so he mostly listened. On the 26th, Hill sat in the saddle at the head of 6 brigades of infantry and 9 batteries of artillery, about 14,000 men, wearing a red calico shirt, which the men would begin to call his battle shirt. The black felt hat slouched forward, and his sword dangled at his side. Hill's attack relied on Jackson's movements, but Jackson was late. Hill figured that Jackson would be in position by no later than 8 a.m., but it was now 3 p.m. Powell was nervous and agitated at the lack of communication. He took a risk and ordered his men across the Chickahominy. Field's Virginians were in the lead. They sent back the Federal pickets and poured a volley into the abandoned camps. Pots, pans, and tent poles were the only casualties from that volley, but they pressed on to the town of Mechanicsville. When Longstreet and D.H. Hill heard the sounds of battle from Powell's engagement with the Federals around Mechanicsville, they assumed that Jackson and Powell had began their flanking movement and moved across the Chickahominy. Lee accompanied both D.H. Hill and Longstreet. When Lee arrived at Mechanicsville, he learned for the first time that Hill had attacked without Jackson. Lee had no choice. He couldn't disengage now that Hill was attacking, and presumably Jackson would be attacking soon. Once through the town of Mechanicsville, Hill kept up the momentum and pushed eastward, toward the entrenchments of Fitzjohn Porter and his 30,000 Federal infantry. Hill sent his massed infantry against well-entrenched infantry and superior artillery. Although one Confederate brigade broke through the Union line, there was no support to capitalize on it. When darkness covered the battlefield, Hill's men slept on the ground where they stopped fighting. The next morning at 8 a.m., Hill sent the brigade of Maxcy Gregg as the lead unit, since they had not engaged the day before. As they pressed over Beaver Dam Creek, artillery killed 2 men on their left, but the artillery was from Jackson's Valley Army on Hill's left, who again were late in attacking. Hill sent word to Jackson about the friendly fire, and then Hill himself met with Jackson. A short time later, another rider approached the 2 generals. It was Lee. All 3 men dismounted and discussed what to do next. Lee's plan had been altered because Jackson was late again. The Union line had moved to Gaines' Mill. Lee instructed Jackson to swing around the right flank of the Union entrenchments, while Hill hit their center and Longstreet would form on Hill's right. Together, Lee believed, they could break through the fortifications. Hill was the first to arrive in position again. He would not throw his brigades in one at a time like before. Now he would throw the entire weight of the light division against the enemy. 1 p.m. was the time designated for the attack, but Longstreet was not on his right and Jackson was not on his left. Hill could see Union troops strengthening the position in his front. If he didn't move soon, it may be too strong to break. It was now 2:30 p.m., and Hill ordered his brigades in without support, but time was a critical factor. The enemy must be met before the enemy reinforcements could come up. The attack was a slaughter. For the second day in a row, Hill's division was fighting in a death trap at the bottom of a watery ravine. Gregg's brigade was able to pierce the Union line. My men, although now under 3 crossfires and falling thick and fast from one end of the line to the other, never once faltered, some of the men having it hand to hand, clubbing their rifles, then dispatching 4 or 5 with the bayonet. Another soldier noted, "There was no cheering, every man was fighting with his mouth closed and standing his ground with all the courage he could command, and never anywhere do I recall a heavier fire than on the left of our line. General A.P. Hill, that magnificent fighter, showing himself the man he always was." The infantry made repeated assaults but could never gain a permanent breakthrough. The artillery dueled back and forth, with one cannon of the PD artillery firing 239 rounds and became so heated that the barrel bent at the trunnions and the cannon had to be abandoned. Federals began to swarm over Hill's flanks, since neither Longstreet nor Jackson were giving him any support. He ordered his attacks to stop and for the men to lie down where they were. These brave men had done all that any soldiers could do. From having been the attacking, I now became the attacked, but stubbornly, gallantly, was the ground held. After nearly 3 hours of slaughter, Jackson was finally filing in on Hill's left. Longstreet was coming up as well, but the light division could do little more than follow the stronger front line. Lee and Hill rode to the rear of the gigantic attack. As they rode by a tree, they saw a frightened captain hiding behind it. One of Lee's aides described what happened next. General Hill leaped from his horse in fierce anger, denounced the coward, took his sword from him, and attempted to break it over his knee. The sword was of as bad metal as the man who wore it, and bent instead of breaking. General Hill hurled it as far as he could, remounted his horse, and rode on into the charge. The stubborn Federal line broke under the weight of Lee's army, severing the Union Army's ties with the York River Railroad, as well as with the York and Pamunkey Rivers. Even Longstreet gave credit to Hill for his actions during the engagement. The Confederate commanders, except A.P. Hill, claimed credit for the first breach in General Porter's lines. The troops of the gallant A.P. Hill that did as much and effective fighting as any received little of the credit properly due them. It was their long and steady fight that thinned the Federal ranks and caused them to so foul their guns that they were out of order when the final struggle came. Hill's hard-hitting tactics and relentless pursuit of victory had gained Lee's eye as well as the praise of the South.